Hello, class. Welcome back to Anthropology 101 with me, and welcome to our first online class. We're going to pick up where we left off, which is week 7, lecture 2 on the original syllabus. I'm going to rewrite the syllabus and send that all to you soon. Today, we're going to review some of what we went over the last time we met, which was a while ago, and we're going to wrap up our discussion of anthropological approaches to religion. In our last class, we discussed Evans Pritchard's ethnographic research on the Azande people of Central Africa. And we watched a documentary film on Azande beliefs in oracles, in divination, and witchcraft. Witchcraft, of course, the Azande refer to as Mangu. Mangu is the Azande word for witchcraft, and we saw a film about this documentary film last time in class, which is available on YouTube. I'll put a link up to that film on Blackboard for you to watch if you haven't seen it. Last class, we also asked what the relationship is between Mangu as it's practiced by the Azande and the broader category of religion. And we discussed some of the ways in which Mangu may or may not meet various definitions of religion. Let's look again. Let's take one more look at Kenneth Guest's definition of religion, a set of beliefs and rituals based on a unique vision of how the world ought to be and focused often on a supernatural power and lived out in a community. So according to this definition, leaving aside problems with the word supernatural, which we've discussed before, we can ask the question, is Mangu, as it's believed and practiced by the Azande, a religion? Is it lived out in a community? Yes, it is. Is it focused on a supernatural power, something that we would consider to be a supernatural power? Yes, although as we discussed and as Evans Pritchard discussed, the Azande may not see it as supernatural because Mangu is something that's ordinary and everyday. We can then ask, does Azande belief in Mangu contain a vision of how the world ought to be? Is there a clear idea of a moral order to the universe in Azande thought? From the movie, I argue that we can see that there is. Mangu provides what? It provides explanations for why misfortunes befall people. And those explanations are often connected to negative feelings of jealousy or envy that people display towards one another. We saw that very clearly in the film with the case of the man with 2 wives who were not getting along. By providing an explanation for unfortunate events, belief in Mangu also implies a world where those unfortunate events do not occur, and specifically a world where people do not feel jealous or resentful of one another, or certainly a world where people should not feel those negative emotions. In other words, you can argue that there is a sense of how the world ought to be contained in Azande Mangu beliefs and practices. And a sense of how the world ought to be is another key feature of Kenneth Guest's definition of religion, which is not the only definition of religion, of course, but it's a more anthropological definition of religion. And you can argue that Mongu Azande witchcraft fits this specific definition of religion. Remember, we discussed earlier, there are an infinite number of possible definitions of religion, and religion itself is notoriously difficult to define. This is one reason why witchcraft as a word is such a loaded and potentially misleading term. When we think of witchcraft, we're often more likely to think of something like this photo, a woman dressed as a witch, right? And we're much less likely to see the ways in which religious belief and what we call witchcraft might overlap or intersect, right? And that's a potential blind spot in our thinking that we're trying to overcome. What are the similarities between magic and religion? In the Baseball Magic article, the author argued that magic and religion share at least one important feature. Both address the universal human need to minimize uncertainty and insecurity. Everybody, all of us, faces an uncertain future, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in our life. We never know when we could get sick or misfortune could befall us. And both religion and magic offer some kind of relief to these questions, some kind of way of answering them. And you could argue that this function is also shared by witchcraft in its guise of Azande Mongu. Why? Because Mongu, at least for the Azande, also gives a sense of uncertainty by explaining unfortunate events. Moving beyond witchcraft, I want to review a different set of ideas that we discussed in last class, ideas that come to us from the American anthropologist Victor Turner. Turner is best known for introducing two terms to us into the lexicon of anthropology. You may recall are liminality and communitas. Liminality and communitas. Liminality is, among other things, the second step in a three-stage process of what are called rites of passage. Rites of passage are a type of ritual that begin with a person being separated from their normal state in society. They pass through the second stage, which is called the liminal stage. That's where you find the liminality. And then rites of passage end with the person or the group of people's reincorporation out of the liminal stage and back into society. Liminality and the liminal stage in rites of passage are marked by several different things. Being in a liminal phase is a very ambiguous position. It's marked by ambiguity and usually by a removal from society. So you're separated from everyday society. In Turner's words, you're betwixt and between the normal positions of life. Being in a liminal phase involves a change of status, usually lowering your status. It could be inverting your status, or it could put you in a position where you have no status at all, zero status. If many people are going through a liminal phase at the same time, which often is the case, there is usually a sense of egalitarianism among the people who are going through the liminal phase together. Right? However, being in a liminal phase is also often considered to be polluting to people who are outside of it, which is another reason why people in the liminal phase are separated from and removed from society and everyday life. One thing that liminality and rites of passage accomplish for the people who go through them is that they change the status of people. Rites of passage change people's status. People are removed from society. They are put into a liminal phase. And then when they are reincorporated back into society, they have a new status, usually a higher status than what they had before. The liminal phase is also marked by what Victor Turner refers to as communitas. Communitas is like community. It involves a feeling of group cohesion among the people who are going through it, where there is a loss of ego among the participants in the liminal phase. In our last class, I asked what examples of rites of passage that involve a liminal phase or examples of liminality in general can we find in our own society? What are some examples of people passing through a liminal phase in the United States and into a new status afterwards? And we discussed some possible examples last time. One, going to college, for example, something you're all experiencing now. When you go to college, you're taken out of your former status, your former life as a high school student, right? You go through somewhat separated from society, maybe less so at Queens College, but you do have ideally a sense of egalitarianism among the people that you're going to college with. There's going to be a ceremony at the end where you're given a credential, and after you graduate, you will re-enter society with a higher status than you had before, and also theoretically a higher status than people who did not go to college. Another possible example we discussed is going to prison, right? When you're in prison, you're obviously separated from society. You have a very low status. There's also potentially a sense of egalitarianism among people who are in prison. Certainly, people who are in prison are seen as polluting to people outside of prison. And then again, one would hope once you're released from prison, you have then a higher status. As we can see here, Morgan Freeman leaving prison in The Shawshank Redemption. The third example that someone mentioned was being in the boot camp in Army. Going into the Army certainly removes you from society and changes your status. And we can see this in rites of passage are one example of a kind of ritual. We've talked about rituals before in the context of the Baseball Magic article. Rituals are patterned, repetitive, and symbolic acts that are set apart from the normal routines of daily life. And they serve a number of different functions. Rituals can be used for changing the status of people, as in a wedding. Here's the wedding of Barack and Michelle Obama from back in the day. Rituals can be used for controlling unpredictable events, and they can be used for curing the sick, as in with this healing ritual from Indonesia. We're going to discuss rituals similar to this one pictured here at the end of the class today. Symbolism is also a very important component of every ritual. Victor Turner also wrote about symbolism in ritual, and he made a couple of important points relevant to understanding the nature of symbols. First, Turner argued that there is a duality within symbols, meaning that every symbol contains at least two parts or two poles. At one end is what Victor Turner calls the sensory pole. This is the part of the symbol that connects to our emotions. Symbols have important emotional meanings and emotional connections for people, and that part of the symbol is contained in the sensory pole of the symbol. At the other end, symbols have what Turner calls an ideological pole. This is the part of the symbol that connects that symbol to the important social values that people who live in a society where that symbol has meaning, it connects to the important values of the people in that society. Let's take a look at one specific example of a religious symbol and how it contains both of these poles, the ideological pole and the sensory pole. This is the Christian cross, the symbol of the Christian religion. What does the cross represent in terms of the duality of symbols, as Victor Turner has discussed it? On the sensory pole, the cross symbolizes what? It symbolizes, among other things, an emotional connection that people who are practicing Christians have to the religion, or perhaps more specifically, to the passion of Christ, to his suffering on the cross. On the other hand, on the ideological pole, the cross can symbolize an ideological connection to a specific value, for example, the value of Christian sacrifice. This is one example of a specifically religious symbol and how it exhibits this polarity between the sensory pole and the ideological pole. Turner also stressed that symbols are what he called multivocal, meaning that each symbol can represent multiple meanings or even conflicting meanings to different people, or that even the same symbol could be interpreted differently by different people. In other words, there is not necessarily one fixed meaning to any symbol. Any symbol can take on multiple meanings to different people in different times and places. Take the example of a non-religious symbol, the United States flag. For most Americans, the flag is a symbol not only of the nation, but also of the nation's values: freedom, democracy, patriotism, and so on. Seen from another perspective, however, for example, imagine an Afghan villager whose family was killed in an American drone strike. The same flag might be seen as a symbol of United States imperialism, of US military aggression, or of economic dominance. This is an example of the multivocality of symbols, how the same symbol can be seen differently by different people and interpreted differently. I want to return now to an earlier question that we've left aside until now, and that's the question, what separates, what differentiates magic from the category of religion? We've already seen that from an anthropological perspective, there are several similarities and points of overlap between these two categories. What are the similarities between magic and religion? Both have beliefs, both use rites and rituals, both have ideas of good and evil, ideas of right and wrong. And both magic and religion can be used to address the problems and uncertainties that people face in their daily lives. What then are the important differences between magic and religion? This is the question that was asked by the famous French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Durkheim saw that there were many similarities between magic and religion, namely the things that we've already discussed, right? But Durkheim argued that the major differences between the two categories, magic and religion, was that religion unifies the group because, he says, it has a church. However, in the case of magic, Durkheim argued there is no church of magic. Magic instead has a clientele. What does it mean to say that magic has a clientele? It means that magicians have customers for their service, and they provide their customers with a service, namely magic. Now, in saying that religion has a church, what does Durkheim mean by that? Does he mean that there has to be a physical building like this? No, that's not what Durkheim means when he says that religion has a church. By a church, Durkheim means a moral community, meaning that there are lasting bonds between the members of that religious community. Magic, on the other hand, in Durkheim's argument, is not united by a moral community. With magic, the only social bonds that exist are the social bonds between individuals, namely the ties between the magicians and their clients, the people who the magicians serve. For Durkheim, religious experience and religious representations are fundamentally social representations. Or to put that in Durkheim's terminology, religious representations are what he calls collective representations. Collective representations are symbolic images or models that are shared by a group of people. And because collective representations are shared by a group of people, they therefore take on an objective character. This means that everyone in the group or the society understands those representations in roughly the same way. Collective representations also have a strongly moral character. They have a moral character because they guide the group's thoughts and they guide the actions of the people in the group. Because collective representations have these three properties, they are first shared by a group, second, they have an objective existence, and third, they have a strongly moral character. Durkheim argues that collective representations form the basis of social solidarity, meaning that they help hold society together. Because magic does not have a moral character, in Durkheim's argument, it therefore cannot be the basis of a greater social solidarity. This sense of social solidarity, of keeping society together within a moral community, is expressed through religion, specifically through ritual. We've already talked about how rituals can be used for controlling external events and for changing the status of people. Beyond those functions, Durkheim argues that religious rituals serve an additional and very important purpose. They work to create social solidarity, and therefore religious rituals, in Durkheim's words, help to hold society together. We see a specific example of ritual in Rachel Mueller's article on boyfriend spirits in Senegal, which we're going to turn to now. The article is up on Blackboard. In Senegal, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, there are what are called Sufi sects. These are mystical sects in Islam where people strive for inner perfection, among other things. And Sufis believe in many different types of spirits. Some spirits are helpful to people. Other spirits are more harmful to people. Sufism, by the way, was before the advent of Wahhabism and other modernist strains of Islam. For hundreds of years, Sufism was the dominant form of Islam in the world. One example that the article discusses of harmful spirits that people believe in Senegal are the Faru Rab boyfriend spirits. Who are the Faru Rab boyfriend spirits, and what do they do? They're spirits that are believed to possess the bodies of young women. Why? The spirits are believed to desire relationships with attractive young women, and so those spirits possess them, causing them to act in irrational and sometimes in violent ways. One woman in the chapter who is possessed by the Faru Rab spirits, for example, threw a pot of boiling water onto her boyfriend. This is an example of what we call spirit possession. Now remember, spirit possession is not the same thing as spirit mediumship. Spirit mediums are religious specialists who become possessed after inviting the spirits to enter their bodies, and they do this in a controlled ritual environment. Why do they invite the spirits to enter their bodies? They do so in order to gain answers to specific questions from the spirits, and also to try to heal people who suffer from various illnesses that are believed to be caused by the spirits. That's spirit mediums. Spirit possession, on the other hand, is an involuntary possession by the spirits, where the spirit enters your body without you asking it to, and this often makes the possessed person sick or act in a way that could be described as crazy. Those are two differences between spirit possession and spirit mediumship. There's an additional very important gender difference as well between these two categories, spirit possession and spirit mediums. In most societies that have these beliefs, spirit mediums can be either men or they can be women. It's a profession and it could be open to either gender. However, with spirit possession, the people who suffer from this the most tend to be women and not men. The question then becomes why? What explains the fact that In societies where this happens, women are more frequently possessed by spirits than men are. The emic explanation for this, of course, the explanation that people in these societies who experience this give, right, is that there are invisible spirits out there who choose to take over the bodies of humans. But we have to ask, from an Edic perspective, how do we as anthropologists explain this phenomenon? And from an Edic perspective, there are at least two different possible explanations. The earliest and least convincing explanation for spirit possession is what you could call the nutritional deficit hypothesis. This hypothesis argues that people who exhibit symptoms of spirit possession are actually suffering from nutritional deficiencies. They're people who just aren't getting enough to eat, and supposedly, in this argument, women are more likely to suffer from such nutritional deficiencies than men are in societies where possession happens. This hypothesis is unconvincing, however, because it is a biologically reductionist argument that misses key cultural and political elements of spirit possession in the societies where it happens. And as cultural anthropologists, we always want to pay attention to the cultural and the political elements of any question. Another explanation for spirit possession, favored by Rachel Mueller and by many other anthropologists, is that you find possession in contexts where women have relatively little power in society compared to men. You can call this hypothesis the power and resistance hypothesis. In this argument, spirit possession, where a possessed woman temporarily loses control of her body, is a culturally approved way for women to rebel or protest against their marginalization in societies where women generally have second-class status compared to men. Spirit possession in this argument becomes a way for marginalized women to temporarily gain control over their lives. How so? Because by losing control, because of the spirit possession event, women are temporarily absolved of responsibility for their actions. If you throw a pot of boiling water in the face of your boyfriend, you're not going to get in trouble for that if you can claim that you're being possessed by a spirit, and it was actually the spirit that made you do that and not you. So you're absolved for your actions, and women, possession also allows the people who are possessed greater freedom to protest their marginal position in society. In Senegal, women who are possessed also gain the attention, help, and resources of a couple of important figures in that society. The first is the Marabout, who in Senegal is an Islamic holy man. They are able to help people, women who are possessed by spirits in that society. More importantly is the figure of the Ndepkot. The Ndepkot, as you can read in Mueller's article, is a female ritual healer. Ndepkots perform rituals to appease the boyfriend spirits, convince them to go away and stop possessing the women, thereby curing the women of their possession. The Ndepkot system of healing is important in Senegal for a couple of reasons. It gives women positions of power and authority that are recognized in Senegalese society as legitimate. Remember, this is a very male-dominated society where there are very few positions of power and authority that are available to women. The Endebkot is one of the few such positions, and all Endebkot are women, and they are the ones who heal people who are possessed by boyfriend spirits. The Faru Rab spirits are also a pre-Islamic belief, and Mueller's chapter raises the question of how this can be the case. She asks, how is it that boyfriend spirits, belief in boyfriend spirits, can coexist with Islam in Senegal? In her analysis at the end of the chapter that she wrote, Mueller draws a distinction between what she calls historic religions and archaic religions. This terminology is itself a little bit archaic. Nobody really uses these terms anymore. And this distinction is now better thought of and described as being that between world religions on the one hand and local religions on the other. Islam, in the case of Senegal, would be the world religion, and belief in the Faru Rab boyfriend spirits would be the local religion. And world religions and local religions are often in tension with each other where they do exist, because the leaders of world religions often preach to their congregations that people should no longer practice elements of the local religion, even when those people continue to do so. So the question is, how is it that local religions and world religions continue to coexist in places where people have converted to the world religion like Islam or Christianity? Mueller argues that local religions and world religions coexist in situations where the two address different problems. For the world religion, the problems that are addressed are the big questions like mortality, death, what happens to us when we die, what is the fate of our soul, the big questions like that, the existential questions that the local religions generally never touched upon. The local religious traditions, on the other hand, focus on more day-to-day problems, right? In this argument, local religions and world religions coexist where the two explain different sets of problems at different levels. This analysis can also be applied to the Azande case as well, and in fact, at the end of the documentary film on the Azande, which we did not watch in class, the film also makes this point. So we can ask, how is it that the Azande can be both Christians and also believe in Mangu? We saw in the film, the only person who didn't practice Mangu was the local Catholic priest, and he said everyone else who was a Catholic nevertheless still practiced Mangu, still believed in what we call witchcraft. For the Azande, Christianity might answer the bigger questions, like what happens to us after we die, but it is less successful for the Zande in answering the more mundane day-to-day questions or more daily problems that people in that society face. Like, why did your wife become sick? Why did the granary fall on your head when you were sitting underneath it? Why weren't you successful in the hunt? That pretty much wraps up what I have for today. There's one more reading I want to talk about briefly. It's on the syllabus. It's for week 7. It's the chapter by Rudnitsky on Islamic finance in Malaysia. This is in the Kenneth Guest textbook. This chapter shows us a couple of things. It shows us the transnational nature of religion. World religions aren't confined to just one country, but span the world across national boundaries. This chapter is also a good introduction and good transition to our next unit, which will be starting next week, because it discusses the intersection of religion and economics. And we're going to be discussing economics and cultural foundations of the economy beginning next week. The important question that the Rudnitsky chapter asks is, how is Islamic finance different from conventional Western capitalism? Any of you who are practicing Muslims probably already know the answer to this. The answer is that Islamic finance prohibits the payment of interest, right, which is something that Western capitalism does not do. Western capitalism is all about charging that interest rate, right? Islamic finance also promotes risk sharing and profit sharing agreements between investors and the people that are investing, rather than transfer all that risk onto their clients. That's basically the main idea of the Rudnitsky chapter on Islamic finance. Next week, we're going to move into new territory to discuss the cultural foundations of economies. And we're going to begin next week with a discussion of different types of exchange. So get ready.